Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the third in a series of 5 reviews that I'm doing on the Super Mario series. If you've never watched these videos before, I recommend starting with my Mario 64 video instead, as this one continues on where the previous videos left off. As such, this video will be talking about several Mario games in depth. It's recommended you play them before watching these videos if possible. Super Mario Galaxy released in 2007 for the Nintendo Wii. Things kick off with an opening sequence not dissimilar from Sunshine, where some light gameplay is interspersed between cutscenes and text boxes. Unfortunately, the introduction is even longer this time around, although only by a few more minutes compared to Sunshine. I think this all comes down to the way the hubs work in each game. In 64 and Sunshine, the hub where the player selected their level was a miniature stage in and of itself. A safe place that acted as a sandbox for players to discover things and test their skills. In Galaxy, the hub is much more barren, and most importantly, it's not laid out in a similar fashion to most stages in Galaxy. In other words, players can't use the hub in Galaxy to familiarize themselves with the curved nature of the planetoids and other objects they'll be running around during proper stages. Instead, it's the first objective where Mario needs to chase down some rabbits, which acts as a way for players to adjust to the unique level geometry. It seems they should have combined the two into one. The hub could have acted as a tutorial by asking the player to move from one side of a planetoid to another in order to enter the first level. This would have had the same benefits as the introduction to Mario 64. New players could run around for a bit, but experienced players could skip straight to the good stuff. The tutorializing in general is much more heavy-handed this time around. Some specific minigames are given their own 4 segments where the player is shown how to hold the Wii controller before it can begin. I can kind of understand this since the Wiimote is a very unique controller, although I wish the little pictures that showed up to explain it didn't look quite so ugly. Anyway, I may not enjoy being forced into tutorials for things, but as I said before, the Mario games are clearly designed to have a wide appeal, so I get where the designers were coming from. What I can't stand and can't excuse is the way the player is continually lectured for the whole playthrough. Even most of the way into the game, there's a decent chance that finishing a level will drop you back into the center of the hub to hear something new from Rosalina. For some reason, it's deemed critical that the player knows when the library opens up or when Luigi appears, even though there's almost nothing else to explore on the spaceship anyway. It would have been much better for the player to discover this sort of thing by themselves, as was expected in 64 and Sunshine. I'm more forgiving with tutorials in Mario games than I would be for many other games, but there comes a point where it has to stop. I know it's made for children to enjoy as well, so training wheels should be expected, but once those wheels come off, they should stay off. Thankfully, the level design makes up the slack here by getting to the point right away. Even in the very first stage, the Good Egg Galaxy, there are lethal pits that the player can potentially fall into. It's not surprising for a platformer to have a few bottomless pits, but they're introduced here far more quickly than they were in either of its predecessors. Even just a couple of stages later, the Rocky Road Galaxy has a very interesting setup with lots of holes and moving platforms. It's easy to see how stages like these may have been inspired by the secret stages in Sunshine, which were very abstract and linear in nature. To say that Galaxy is just an extension of the Sunshine stages would be to undersell it though. At times it leans more towards Mario 64's open-ended exploration, with the Honey Hive Galaxy being the perfect example. If you dropped the main part of this stage into Mario 64, it would blend in perfectly. Other times it does swap over into more focused challenges like the Toy Time Galaxy, which is usually a series of straightforward platforming missions. In between, there's a whole host of planetoids and missions that can't be attributed to either of the previous games. What makes Galaxy's level design special compared to its predecessors, aside from the obvious gravity tricks, is the way it swaps frequently between different kinds of challenges and levels within the same mission. We'll be here all day if I try to discuss every level of Galaxy, but let me just run through a good example to demonstrate the point. For the 3rd star in the Space Junk Galaxy, the player has to do a huge variety of things. First of all, it starts with the player using the pull stars, which leads them to the glass-covered planetoid. Once there, they have to find an opening and explore the insides like a maze until they find the launch star. After the launch star, a new gameplay mechanic is introduced, webbing that the player can use to fling themselves whatever direction they point. Next, the player rapidly slingshots between debris, avoiding spiders along the way. Once that's all done, there's a boss fight which immediately makes use of the new mechanic. Taken on its own, this is an impressive amount of variety, but in the greater context of Galaxy as a whole, it's even better, because the player might not encounter that webbing again for another 10 or 20 stages. The level design here never gave anything a chance to get boring, and it escalated the webbing from introduction to boss fight in the space of a minute. I'd say that deserves a gold star. Anyway, the variety in the level design would all be for nothing if those various tasks didn't feel good in and of themselves. Thankfully, the supplemental gameplay mechanics all feel polished and unique thanks to skillful use of the Wiimote. Most of these mechanics focus on the pointing feature of the Wiimote, which is by far the most consistent and intuitive part of its motion controls. On the other hand, the gyroscope is used for minigames like the manta ray surfing, which can feel a little finicky and tricky as a result. The difference between gyroscope controls and pointing controls comes down to feedback. Using the gyroscope to roll a ball around is ostensibly like using an analog stick. You need to tilt it in the direction you want to move. The difference is the analog stick has a spring which provides physical feedback, but the gyroscope doesn't. This means the player has to rely more on visual information in order to adjust their movements. Unfortunately, the visual feedback in these minigames is delayed because even though the player might be tilting backwards, the ball might still be rolling forwards due to some previous momentum. It takes time for the player's input to have an effect, which makes it hard to judge just how far the controller should be tilted one way or the other. With a pointer, it's a much more simple and instant form of feedback that allows for precise and timely responses from the player. Even so, the ball rolling and manta games aren't bad, and there's certainly been much worse uses for the Wiimote both before and since this game's release. Outside of the minigames, the focus is almost entirely on the cursor and rarely on the gyroscope, which is why I think Galaxy has some of the best use of the Wiimote out there. Even now, after the novelty is worn off, using the pointer to drag webs around or activate the pull stars feels very natural. The main use the pointer has is collecting star bits, and this is again another great use of the controller. If you want to stop every time the star bits are on screen and pick them all up, you can, but the challenge, and the fun, comes in trying to control Mario and collect the star bits at the same time. This introduces a multitasking element which I don't think the series has ever really seen before. I suppose this does for collectibles what the Flood did for platforming. It lowers the skill floor since the star bits can be picked up with the cursor, but raises the skill ceiling since getting them as quickly as possible requires focusing on two things at once. If this was all the star bits did, then I think I'd have to say they're a universally good addition, but they have a knock-on effect which was probably unintended. Coins are an integral part of the Mario series, but they've become increasingly worthless with every iteration of the series, largely because lives have become increasingly more prevalent and pointless. On top of that, the star bits also provide much more benefit. Picking up 50 star bits will provide a life along with adding to the player's total, which they can use to unlock more levels. They can even be used to stun enemies, which means they simultaneously act as ammunition, currency to unlock more stages, and a way to earn more lives. If there was a point in Galaxy where the player had to choose between 50 star bits or 50 coins, there would be absolutely no benefit to picking the coins. At least coins require Mario to touch them in order to pick them up, which is obviously something that players should be doing in a platformer, but the question is whether players will bother to do that at all. Coins can still have intrinsic value because it feels good to collect them or because the player has been conditioned to do so, but their extrinsic value is extremely weak. They can't even be used to earn stars anymore. The only thing they can do that star bits can't is restore health, which to be fair is a little more important this time around thanks to a reduction in Mario's maximum vitality. Considering Mario only has 3 pieces of health at most, it seems a little extreme to refill an entire chunk of that just by picking up 1 coin. It could have been rebalanced so that the player would need 5 or 10 coins to restore each piece of health, which would have incentivized the player to collect coins more often. Players are more likely to lose health this time around, since enemies are much more abundant and the linear design amplifies them into a bigger threat than they were before. Along with the usual Mario enemy types, there comes quite a few new ones this time around, many of which are more interesting than the classic ones since they're built from the ground up for 3D Mario mechanics. The new enemy types tend to be more aggressive than the old ones, which helps solve the issue of players avoiding them. Nintendo may have felt more comfortable with the lower health and increased enemies thanks to the optional co-op mode where a second player can weaken enemies for player 1. I'll admit I've never used this mode except for review purposes, but it still strikes me as a nice inclusion, and probably didn't take much effort to make. I particularly like how most enemies will give star bits if killed with a spin, but give a coin if jumped on directly. Players will most likely want the coin if they've lost some health, but since spin attacks are easier to execute, this leaves the player with a dilemma. Either they can take the easy kill and leave Mario on low health, or risk the harder kill and gain some health back. It's a very minor mechanic of course, but injecting a little decision making is a good thing, and it goes to show how a Mario game can benefit from having two different currencies. The star bits and coins could easily have been balanced better by making coins a requirement for unlocking more levels, but at least the introduction of purple coins makes more sense. The level layouts in Galaxy are usually very linear, and depending on what star the player chooses at the start, the designated path through the level can change drastically. This would make getting 100 coins a tedious chore if it had been done in the Mario 64 way. Every level would suffer from the same problem as Peanut Park, where the player could lock themselves out of getting enough coins. This is why these purple coin challenges have to be a separate mission rather than just something the player decides to do themselves. Personally, I think collecting all the coins is generally a satisfying task, so I'm glad to see these 100 coin challenges weren't abandoned entirely, but I suppose that's a very subjective view. To put it in more objective terms, an abundance of mandatory collectibles allows the level designer to place them in areas that forces the player to explore the stage and their abilities more thoroughly. Used in moderation, as they are in Galaxy, collectibles can be a very powerful tool for a platform game to have. It's the star chips that fulfill this role during most levels, and they perform their job admirably thanks in part to some good level design techniques. Usually, when Mario arrives on a planet that requires some star chips to proceed, at least one or two of the pieces will be readily available. This gives an immediate goal and a reason to get moving. The level essentially tells the player to pick up the first star chip and then continue looking for more, which will usually come into view as the perspective starts shifting around. It's an extremely effective setup, which is utilised often but never becomes stale. In fact, the level design in general in Galaxy is something to be admired. Despite the fact that the player launches themselves to different areas 2 or 3 times per stage, the goal always remains instantly clear and understandable. This can be at least partially attributed to the levels being much more linear than 64 or Sunshine, but that's not the whole story. There are plenty of examples where the level designers show an absolute mastery of their craft by guiding the player towards objectives using nothing more than camera angles and intuitive level layouts. Take a look at this bit in the Gold Leaf Galaxy where the player lands on a planetoid. Since the area is fairly large and open, the level designer made the objective clear by placing the star right above where the player lands. You've been told what to do the second you arrive on this planet. Find a way to get higher. I'd like to show a couple more examples of simple but effective design in various parts of the game before I move on, as I feel it's one of the things Galaxy really gets right. In the Matter Splatter Galaxy, the player has to keep up with some disappearing paths, and eventually reaches a point where they need to use the spring power-up. They could have just set up an invisible trigger here that started the next challenge when the player arrived in the area. That's what they do in other parts of the stage, but here it's different. Since the level unlocks in Galaxy are non-linear in nature, the player may never have used the spring power-up by this point. It's unlikely, but it is possible, and the designer factored this possibility into the situation. Before the level will start moving again, the player has to grab a token placed very high off the ground. This ensures that the player has the spring power-up and knows how to do a high jump with it before they move on, giving time and a safe place for players to test the spring. The best part about this is that players who have used the spring before will probably grab it and grab the token without thinking twice about the situation. It's a perfect solution for everyone. Bowser's Dark Matter Plant is one of my favourite levels thanks to its simple but effective challenge escalation. By this point the player has entered some areas of Galaxy with upside down gravity, but this level introduces sections where Mario falls sideways. Since this is technically a new kind of challenge, the player is given a freebie to start off with. Just by jumping onto the closest part of this platform, they'll make it to the next section, and even if they fall off, there's an easy path back up. Once they reach the next similar shape, the onus is on the player to jump to the further side of the platform or else they'll fall off. Again, if they do happen to fall off, there's some space below to land on. With those two situations out of the way, the lethal variants are introduced, and the gravity mechanic soon reaches its logical conclusion with a plus-shaped platform where the player needs to utilise every side at least once in order to stay safe. Thankfully, this game also marks the return of visual design more in line with Mario 64, which was very abstract in nature but effectively communicated its gameplay elements. It's obvious that webs will be sticky. It's obvious that this red platform is dangerous. It's obvious that B Mario will be able to walk on flowers, but be vulnerable to rain. Setting the game in space raises the interesting problem of where the player should fall when you want them to die, and black holes are the perfect answer. They're not just a visual excuse for Mario to lose a life when he falls off the wrong place, they're also a way for the game to signal danger beforehand. Players will want to explore the underside of some surfaces, and the black holes tell them in advance whether it's safe to do so. All of this is to say, if there was a book of best practices in level design, Galaxy would probably tick every box at least once. None of these techniques are particularly innovative or mind-blowing, but they're used so often and so effectively that it's really something to behold. Sadly, even the best of us can fall into lazy or bad habits sometimes, and Galaxy is no exception. Using the launch stars to boost Mario through space like a shooting star is initially a wonderful reward for completing a task, and sometimes affords the opportunity to present the environments from interesting camera angles. As an occasional way to treat the player to Galaxy's aesthetics, they work great, but there's an over-reliance on them to get the player from one location to the other, which hurts the flow of the gameplay. Since the most the player can do during these is pick up some star bits using the cursor, they're essentially glorified cutscenes. There's no danger, and no way for the player to complete these segments faster or slower depending on their skill. As such, they can start to get in the way of enjoyment on subsequent playthroughs. Combined with the intros to each stage, and the occasional interruption by a Luma or short cutscene, this means the player is rarely in full control for more than a minute or two at a time. These may be masking a hidden load time in some instances, which is fair enough, but I doubt that's always the case. There's other situations where the player moves smoothly from one part of the level to another, with no load time and no break in the gameplay. Considering how many different creative ideas are packed into Galaxy, I'm sure the team could have come up with a few more ways to move from area to area which left the player with more control. These sequences undoubtedly provide some lovely visuals, but that's of limited value when the rest of the game looks so good anyway. It helps that on a purely aesthetic level, the space theme makes a surprising amount of sense for a platform game, as well as having a unique flair to it which makes it stand out from the previous games in the series. Despite coming fairly early into the life cycle of the Wii, the graphics were some of the most appealing the console would ever see, thanks in large part to good visual design. Every area seems to be loaded with sparkly particle effects and bright attractive colours which are very easy on the eyes. Most interesting, however, is the lighting, which posed an interesting problem since the player needs to run around, across and inside all kinds of environments. It would be very difficult to evenly light each area with directional light sources, so Galaxy relies more on ambient lighting instead. If you're not familiar with this, you can think of it as just a number which decides how bright the whole level should be and lights everything the same amount. Using just ambient lighting would have been very flat and boring, however, so there are definitely some techniques at play to make the scenes look a little more attractive. Based on the way the textures behave, my guess is there's also a soft directional light attached to each stage. In some instances, like the Dusty Dune Galaxy, the ambient lighting drowns out the directional lighting, making the scene look extremely evenly lit. In other stages, like the Gusty Garden Galaxy, the ambient lighting is turned down a little, which results in some darker patches on the underside of the planetoids. This effect is especially noticeable on the environmental textures, a lot of which seem to have a small specular element to them, an effect which would normally be restricted to reflective or metallic objects. If the grass ever looks glossy, then this is why. This is a subtle effect which contributes to the bright and shiny feel of the game in general. It's hard to say exactly how all this was achieved, but in theory it would have been a relatively simple solution compared to most modern games, and allowed the level designers to create the stages without worrying about how to light any particular area. The lighting isn't the only area of Galaxy which shows that sometimes the simplest solution is the best. In my Mario 64 video, I argued that inertial frames may have made the moving platforms more enjoyable, but realistic concepts aren't always necessarily better, and the gravity in Galaxy proves as much. Obviously, the small objects, which make up most of the levels, would never generate enough gravitational force to make Mario fall as he does, but that's not the only liberty taken with the physics. The perfect example is the question mark shaped planetoid in the Gusty Garden Galaxy where, in a real world scenario, the center of mass here would actually be outside of the object. This would result in some really unpredictable effects when Mario jumped around on the surface. He might even get stuck in the air. Instead of simulating gravity, the game takes a much more simple, pragmatic, and enjoyable approach. The various planetoids have bounding areas which define whether Mario should be in the pull of one planet or another. Once that's decided, Mario is simply pulled towards whichever point is underneath him. This is what allows Mario to walk around unimpeded on the strangely shaped planets, and makes for a much more easily understandable set of rules for the player to follow. This may also be the reason why Galaxy has the inertial frames of reference which the previous games lacked, or at least something approximating the same effect. Jumping on a moving platform results in Mario landing in the same place. This, combined with the new camera system, makes moving platforms a more common and enjoyable experience than they were in the previous games, since it's much more clear what effect the player's movements will have. Unfortunately, as with so many aspects of game design, what works for one situation can often be detrimental if applied to other areas of the same game. To put it simply, the camera in Galaxy sometimes has the opposite problem of the one in Sunshine. While Sunshine would have benefited from a more stable camera angle instead of constantly trying to snap behind Mario, Galaxy's camera can sometimes feel too rigid. In theory, the camera buttons are either supposed to rotate or center the viewpoint around Mario, but in practice they often fail to do anything at all. For a lot of the game this feels fine, but on spherical worlds this can result in an awkward control scheme which starts to feel worse the longer the player moves around. As the camera slowly drifts around, the analog control can feel increasingly out of sync until the stick moves back to the resting position, which does solve the issue temporarily, but kills Mario's momentum. These issues aside, the camera of Galaxy does its job pretty well. In fact, in many places it's better than the one in Sunshine. Since it's much more heavily scripted, it often provides a sensible view on the action. Sometimes it's from the side, sometimes it's from above, a lot of the times it pushes the player in a certain direction. Considering how many different miniature levels there are inside all the stages of Galaxy, it's impressive the camera isn't a complete disaster. That said, it would obviously be best for the larger stages to have a free moving camera tied to a second analog stick in the same way Sunshine had. Obviously this isn't possible with the Wiimote, so for the first time a 3D Mario game feels like it made concessions for its controller rather than the other way around. This is my biggest problem with Galaxy, the simplification of the controls and movement mechanics which were necessary to get the game working on the Wii. If you ask me, the biggest mistake Nintendo made with the controller was the placement and size of the A button. I understand they wanted the thing to look simple and inviting, and I'm not suggesting it should have been plastered with buttons like an actual remote, but just one extra button placed on the front might have made a huge difference. As usual, Mario can jump in Galaxy, but the dive move, which used to be mapped to the B button, has been completely dropped. As a result, Mario has a much weaker sense of momentum than before. The only way to gain more speed is to do a long jump, which is considerably more clumsy than the diving and sliding of the previous games. At least this time there's a little more leeway on the mid-air control, but long jumping everywhere to get the maximum speed is too repetitive and cumbersome to be much use. Compared to Sunshine, this is a huge step backwards. There's no hovering, no spin jump, no water sliding, and no diving. The one additional move this time is a mid-air spin, which often comes in handy but resets Mario's momentum whenever it's used. Compared to the hovering ability of Sunshine, it feels considerably less fluid. There's plenty of justifications why the team may have wanted to simplify the movement. The controller may have been the problem, they may have deemed the experimentation with planetoids more important, or it may have been an attempt to make the game more accessible. For someone just starting out in the 3D Mario series, I'm sure Galaxy has more than enough to keep them occupied. But moving from 64 or Sunshine to Galaxy can make the latter feel frustratingly limited. Any other 3D platformer would do well to have controls that feel as tight and responsive as Galaxy, but it's a clear step down when the previous entry in the series had arguably the deepest control scheme ever devised for a 3D platformer. While Mario 64 and Sunshine were enjoyable largely because of their movement mechanics, Galaxy is enjoyable in spite of them. The best example is the very start of Galaxy, which sees the player chasing down rabbits. Taken at face value, it's a perfectly enjoyable introduction, but if we imagine that the level was flat, then it's obvious it would be more enjoyable if Mario had more moves. In that case, we could dive after the rabbits or maybe use the flood to stun them. In Galaxy, chasing the rabbits just means moving the analog stick in the correct direction. Even the long jump is too floaty to be much use. That said, it does manage to be entertaining thanks to the curved nature of the level. This is what I mean when I say the game is enjoyable in spite of Mario. There's all sorts of interesting things going on around Mario, which keep the player engaged, but Mario himself is much less complex than before. Unfortunately, the same problems can be felt in the new power-ups too. The flying power-up is a great example of what Galaxy does wrong compared to the other two games. In Mario 64, the flight cap was admittedly very tough to control, probably the hardest thing to do properly in the entire game, but it felt like flying. Going through a level with the flight cap actually feels like Mario is soaring through the air thanks to the subtle changes in velocity based on Mario's pitch. In Galaxy, the power-up is admittedly a lot easier to use, and maybe even more useful as a result, but it feels incredibly stiff and boring somehow. Mario just moves whatever direction you point, and there's no complexity to it at all. The whole thing feels like it could have been coded in an afternoon, whereas in 64 you can tell a lot of effort went into tweaking the numbers until it felt right. B Mario is another example. It may be one of the more imaginative power-ups the series has ever seen, but its implementation is equally as simplistic as anything else in Galaxy. You press a button and Mario goes up, you let go and he goes down. It's slower than walking, has no depth to it, and even removes Mario's ability to jump. This isn't to say that these power-ups can't be fun occasionally, but it says a lot that I don't particularly seek them out either. Thankfully, one of this game's skills is in not overusing its various novelties, which helps keep their charm intact despite their simplistic gameplay. The addition which feels most fleshed out is the ice skating, a brilliant solution to a problem which platformers have had for years. Obviously the designers want to use ice to increase the challenge of moving through a level, but the way this was accomplished left a lot to be desired. Making the player character slip all over the place is slow and not a great deal of fun, so Galaxy provides the option to start skating instead. This brings its own challenges since it's much faster, and it looks a lot more stylish. It's an improvement in every way. The shells Mario can use underwater are another similar change, which provides a big improvement over the previous swimming mechanics. It's still no match for running and jumping, but it's a lot less cumbersome and slow than before. At the very least, these are mechanics which should be brought forward to future games, unless an alternative is developed that improves them even more. Unfortunately, the movement mechanics aren't the only step back compared to previous games. The hub world feels particularly barren this time around. This may be one of the pitfalls of getting something so right on the first try. When it comes time to make a sequel, it's hard to know what route to take. In Sunshine, they seemed unsure of how to top the clever castle antics of 64, but in Galaxy it's as though they don't even try. On top of this, there's the prankster comets, which are an even bigger problem. Part of the reason Mario 64's castle was such a success was because it allowed the player to do what they want, when they wanted to. Not every player is going to enjoy everything equally, and the non-linear nature of the castle allows the player to customize the pace at which they go through each stage. Sunshine was flawed in this area too, but at least if we ignore what it takes to get to the ending sequence, it more or less functioned in the same way as its predecessor. Galaxy, on the other hand, has 5 bottlenecks the player must complete before unlocking more levels, and as soon as the comets show up, the player's freedom is arbitrarily restricted even further. If you like the Cosmic Mario races and want to race him on a specific level, you don't have a way of doing that except paying off a Luma to shuffle the comets, which can be a time-consuming process. Even worse, if you want to play a certain stage, but there's a comet in orbit, you have to take the comet mission or pay off the Luma. Worst of all are the purple comets, which are only unlocked after getting 60 stars and beating the final level. Personally, I like the purple coin challenges, but that doesn't necessarily mean I want to do so many of them back to back. It would have been much more enjoyable to space this stuff out over the course of the whole game, but as it is now, there's no way to do that. I can't see the benefits to the comets at all. Instead of unlocking more content as you progress, you unlock the chance to unlock more content. It's just a pointless extra step that doesn't need to exist in a Mario game. Boss fights aren't necessary for a platform game either, but show up here in abundance. This doesn't really come as a surprise, since the 2D Mario games have often had many boss fights, but it's the first 3D Mario to really make use of them. 64 and Sunshine both had some boss fights near the start, but seemed to give up on the idea after the first few stages. Galaxy carries them on for the whole game, with 10 of the 15 major galaxies having at least one boss fight, and a few extra fights outside of those, including 3 with Bowser. Looking at the sheer numbers, I might be ready to criticise Galaxy for focusing too much on such a secondary element, but execution is everything, and the fights all feel quite polished. At the very least, none of them are particularly annoying or unenjoyable. The most important thing is they almost always come after an entire level's worth of platforming, so it's impossible to see them as a form of padding. Setting up the character models, behaviour, animations and camera scripting for boss fights is probably a lot more labour intensive than just creating a couple of random planetoids, so they're not a result of lazy development. That said, it could easily come across as lazy if just defeating the boss granted the star without any other platforming. This is the kind of cheat the game does pull here and there, with some boss fights being reused as comma challenges, but I wouldn't say it's common enough to be problematic. It seems this time around the team really got to grips with boss fight mechanics, and as such they were able to give Bowser the send-off he deserves. As in Mario 64, Bowser is fought in 3 increasingly difficult encounters, but the introduction of new mechanics each time helps keep it feeling fresh. By focusing on what makes Galaxy unique, the team were able to craft a fight which perfectly matches its own game, making great use of the planetoids and Mario's spin attack. The icing on the cake is the dynamic music, which contributes a considerable amount to the proceedings, turning the battle between a plumber and an evil turtle into something which seems weirdly epic. As technology has improved and games moved away from MIDI-based music towards using physical instruments, some have even had the budget to use a real orchestra to record their music. Galaxy is one such game, and combined with the new celestial aesthetics, it creates a sort of graceful atmosphere I don't think anyone expected to see from a Mario title. Obviously, there are some standout tracks which really make the most use of the heavy brass instruments and violins, like the Gusty Garden Galaxy music, but what's most impressive to me is the restraint shown by the composers. I imagine if you're a composer and you're told you can finally have an entire orchestra to play with, it would be very tempting to rely on this loud, climactic sort of music to make the most use of your resources. Instead, they've made the more difficult, but smart choice of matching the music to the level, even if that means half the orchestra goes unused or they have to fall back to synthesizers. For example, since the space junk level is just a pile of debris, they use this music to impress upon us the quiet emptiness of space. Similarly, there's the Honey Hive stage, which has a relaxed, tropical sound reminiscent of Sunshine. It's the contrast between tracks like these which makes the rest of the music stand out so much, and of course it helps that most of it is as catchy as the previous entries in the series. Boss fights may not be necessary for a platformer, but at least they have a gameplay element to them. Some would say that the story is even more frivolous. For the most part I'd agree, but there are some cases where a bit of storytelling can be useful or even necessary. Although I complained about the opening of Sunshine being a bit too long, I can at least see why the team wanted to contextualize Mario's actions in that game. Players needed to have a reason why they should clean up graffiti, and the opening gives them that explanation. Galaxy doesn't need as much setup, since we're supposed to accept by default that the small planets and weird objects in space are just the way this universe works. It does go to the trouble of creating an origin story for Rosalina, however, which is told in a storybook format. While it's a little unfortunate that this can be triggered by the player simply walking into the library, it's an otherwise nice compromise for players who are interested in a little more storytelling in their Mario games. The children's book format makes for a surprisingly effective method of explaining Rosalina's history, and it's completely optional for players who aren't interested. I for one am glad this is in the game, and think the writing and pictures are of good enough quality that they could even have been physically sold outside of the game itself. That said, after experiencing it on my first playthrough, I haven't had the desire to see it again, and that's perfectly fine. Games and stories are very different when it comes to what we call replayability. Stories aren't replayable in the same way that games are, since they're static while games are dynamic. We can still enjoy revisiting some of our favourites from time to time, of course, but a game with high replay value is always going to hold up a bit better than even the most intricate narrative. By decoupling the gameplay from the story in this way, it allows players to take advantage of the replayability of the game itself without being dragged through the cutscenes again. All Galaxy really needs is a short start and ending sequence to give the player a satisfying sense of closure, and thankfully it succeeds in doing so. Taken level by level, Galaxy undoubtedly has more things to see, do, avoid and jump on than either of its predecessors, maybe more than both of them combined. The more linear level design can feel somewhat restrictive after the free-form areas of the previous games, but there's no denying there's some advantages to this style as well. Based solely on what it tries to accomplish, almost any way you look at it, Galaxy is a resounding success. The only way to see it as a disappointment or failure is to look at it in the larger context of the Mario series as a whole. In that case, it can easily be seen as a regression from the mechanical groundwork laid out by its forebears. It's a shame it never quite manages to do for the Wii Remote what Mario 64 did for the analog stick, and may have even been better off were it built for a more traditional controller. The transition here is from great core mechanics to great novelties instead, but thankfully the novelties come in such quantity and quality that they make the experience thoroughly entertaining. As such a radical departure from the previous entries, it succeeds in recapturing some of that magic which so many people experienced with Mario 64. That feeling of not knowing what weird and wonderful thing would be happening next. The space theme may just be an excuse to describe some new gameplay elements, but ultimately Mario Galaxy really is a journey into the unknown, one which is well worth taking. In the next video, we'll be blasting off again with Super Mario Galaxy 2, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.